Thank you for our audience on Zoom for joining us tonight for a lecture that I was particularly looking for by Professor Alex de Voogt, who is going to present a lecture tonight entitled Quarrying Games in Antiquity. I asked Alex to present his original and unique comparative approach to board games in the context of rock art graffiti, taking advantage of his long-standing experience and also, to be honest, his globetrotter abilities. From Palmyra to the pyramids of Meroe through the Gebel el-Silsila, Alex will present us with his latest results on gaming practices in antiquity. He will also demonstrate how game boards are providing essential information to any archaeological site as a major source of information too often neglected. I'm also happy to mention that this lecture is part of the ISAC program for the Year of Games, a University of Chicago-wide initiative celebrating the culture of games. Throughout the 25-26 academic year, this collaborative effort on campus features several events, exhibitions, and activities such as this one. From game design showcases to scholarly panels and lectures, the Year of Games invite the Chicago community to explore how games shape culture, creativity, and foster connections. Alex de Voogt is a professor at Drew University with a special interest in mancala games. He has published extensively on the history and archaeology of board games, as well as on contemporary gaming practices in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. In 1995, he started the Board Game Studies Colloquium series, and in 1998, he co-founded and co-edited the Board Game Studies Journal, both of which still continue today. Alex has brought the word curiosity to another level. He is involved, whether as an advisor or PI, in no less than 4 international research projects with the University of Bologna in Italy on the evolution of symbols and invention of writing, with the European Research Council on the invention of scripts and their beginnings, or the Digital Ludem project modeling the evolution of traditional games with the Maastricht University in the Netherlands, or symbolizing identity marks and their relation to writing in New Kingdom Egypt with the University of Leiden. He also curated or co-curated 4 exhibitions in 23, First Pieces, Board Games in Translation in the Corn Gallery, 22, Script and Materiality at Drew University Library Archives, 22 again, Conserving Active Matter at the Bard Graduate Center, New York, particularly on the Maldivian game board entry. 2019, Eyes on the Board, Crossing Game Space at the Arnold and Sheila Aronson Galleries at the New School Parsons School of Design in New York. Alex, on top of all of this, is also an archaeologist, and that's actually how we met. From 2009 to 2019 at Sai Island, Sudan, and you will hear about this a lot tonight, under the directorship of Dr. Vincent Francini on the excavation of the elite Meroitic necropolis. In 2012, an archaeological survey in North Sudan on animal representations in the Kingdom of Kush, of particular interest to me with the new exhibition coming mid-April, funded with the Nyarkos Award and the American Museum of Natural History. In 2009, he also executed an archaeological survey in Palmyra, Syria, where he documented graffiti gaming. Alex's professional service is outstanding since his PhD at Leiden University in the Netherlands in 1995, with the creation of new programs. I'm just going to take one example for the sake of time that I find particularly illustrative, the one on textiles MFA at the Parsons School of Design in New York. Parsons MFA Textiles program is a dynamic hub of creativity in New York, where makers and designers engage in a rich exchange of ideas and perspectives through hands-on textile making. Promoting authenticity, originality, and innovation, they channel the art, design, and industry initiatives and blur the boundaries between craft and high-tech and foster sustainability and craftsmanship, a topic which is particularly acute now in heritage at-risk project initiatives, such as in Afghanistan as we speak. I had the privilege to meet and work with Alex on the ground at Sai Island, but also behind a desk on a complex endeavor comparing the transmission of architectural traits in monumental architecture in the Nile Valley, particularly on the theme of casemate foundation structures in dense urban networks. We published the paper called Cultural Transmission of Architectural Traits from the Near East to the Meroitic Kingdom in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports, and I'm convinced that we are at the very beginning of the creation of a new model of architectural transmission of craftsmanship methods, expanding and or challenging on the question of the workshop spheres of influence, which is not necessarily applicable everywhere. A gigantic dataset is available for comparison, as this approach was not applied, particularly in architecture, systematically. Alex, of course, pursued this approach in other ranges of material, from textiles to games, from bioanthropology to literature, in a holistic approach that actually reminds me a lot of the encyclopedic ambition that Isaac promoted since its very creation. With 6 books, 3 forthcoming or in press, and no less than 75 articles covering the fields of archaeology, linguistics, cultural anthropology, and writing systems, we have a special treat tonight. And it is my utmost pleasure and honor to invite my dear friend Alex to the stage.
Thank you, Mark, for this very nice introduction. I am very pleased to be here and honored to be here. It's an institute that I visited before. And today I will try to give you some background, some history of the history of games, because we are changing the field of games research mainly through the field of archaeology. So I have to thank Maria Nilsson, who I am collaborating with at the moment on a book which concerns a quarry of el-Silsila in Egypt, and that is also where this photograph was taken, not by me, but by Maria Nilsson from Sweden. I will try and move the slides. So far, no luck, but here we go. So, board games in antiquity. The topic has been interesting for many people for a long time because it is very juicy, I would almost say. The games that have come to mind from antiquity are mostly found in Egypt for the main reason that they are preserved so well in that particular climate. And in Egypt we have found boards, sometimes with pieces to play with, very often with randomizers, just a word for all different types of dice. And we find images, like the one on the right, depictions of players, sometimes gods, sometimes pharaohs, sometimes anonymous players at a board. Not always 2, sometimes just 1. What we do not find are rules. So none of the rules from ancient Egypt that we have uncovered from tombs have any rules. And speculation continues about what the rules are, but that should not stop us from studying the games. And there are particular reasons for that I will go into. So what are those games? It's a small set of games that we have from Egypt. The oldest ones are men and mehen. Men is just a slab that we encounter in some tombs with some lines on them. They vary from 8 to 16 and sometimes 12, so it's not really giving us much information, and that's it. The other one is mehen, which is much more interesting in terms of material culture. It has a spiral snake shape. If it has all the pieces and accoutrement with it, then it has stick dice or throwing sticks. Those are 2-sided dice, so you have only 2 sides. It comes with these little balls and these crouching lions, and we have no clue what to do with them, but they seem to be part of the game. The others are here, examples. This is just a little slide for quizzes in university. So how many games do we see here? There are only 2 games on your slide. And which one is the odd one out, because there are 3 pictures of one game and there is 1 picture of the other game. Don't look at the size of the picture or the color of the background, but it's the blue one that is the odd one out. The blue one is actually Senate, a famous game to us. And all the others are the same game that we refer to as the game of 20 squares. And if you count, you will see that they all three have 20 squares, while the game of Senet has 30 squares. It's a very scientific discipline. Here you see several other examples of three different games. The game of 58 holes, I told you, it's very quantitative. Game of 20 squares and the game of Senet in different guises. And we know they are games because they are also presented as games, depicted as games, famously here in a painting from the tomb of Esiré, where you see the game of Mehen, the snake, including the crouching lions in these little balls. And we see a Senet game on top right, also with the throwing sticks and the pieces. And at the bottom we see a men game, that slab with these lines, and again with some pieces with it. This is also fairly old, it's the third dynasty, so it's very early on. We have these sets of at least 3 board games in the archaeological record. Much later, here is the Turin papyrus. This is the 20th dynasty, so it's about 1150 BCE, if I'm not mistaken. You see here Senet on the top, and then the game of 20 squares at the bottom, and on the top right you see a little corner of the game of 58 holes. So this is how we know they're presented that way, they're portrayed as board games. And once in a while we have another source that can tell us a little bit more. And those, again, are found in Egypt because they were preserved. A few in the Near East, but most of them from Egypt. Gaming boxes with one game on one side and a game on the other side. That is very helpful for us because that means that the same people were playing 2 games. So we don't separate the games for, this is a game for the elite or this is a game for somebody else. No, we have the same people playing the same game. And sometimes we have, this is from Giroft, very special one. Here is the game of 58 holes, and on the other side the game of 20 squares. So again, a context that is exactly the same for 2 different games. Now, what can you do with this? Mark already mentioned that, so you can map them all. So let's take the game of 20 squares and try to find every single board that we have found so far. And as you can see, most of them are actually in Egypt, even though it is definitely not an Egyptian game. 11 already in Thebes. But if you, map them all out, you can see some patterns emerging. Important for us, the game travels across the borders, quite dramatically so, and has been around for 1,500 years or more. And that is typical for board games. And that's also what makes them so interesting to us. So in this case, we can understand, if you like, the whole transmission of games as mostly going through conquest. So we have Mesopotamia to the Levant to Egypt, and then through trade we see some other additional areas as well. We can do the same for the game of 58 holes, also known as the game of hounds and jackals. Has appeared in a movie or 2. The quintessential examples in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's very small, by the way. It's a very small, tiny little game. But it has all the pins with it. And we can do a similar thing there. And again, you can see that the game is spread all around from Iran to Egypt and all the way to Anatolia. So crossing the border. And again, we can do this reconstruction, and then we see that most of the dispersal of the game of 58 holes has gone through trade, and less so through conquest. This is Egypt, ancient times, connections with Mesopotamia, small set of games, and then things change. So as soon as we arrive in the Greco-Roman era, the set of games changes radically. And the game of Senet is forgotten. It actually moves around. It goes to Cyprus and stays on there. The game of Mehen also stays on in Cyprus, was hardly seen in Egypt. And we get to Roman board games, and they have their own board games. So even though those ancient games that we found in Egypt are found in many places, at some point it stops. Roman board games, again, are found with pieces and with dice, if you like. Now we have depictions of players again, and now we have descriptions of rules. Not for all of them, but for many of them we have some indications. Sometimes it's in poetry, sometimes it's actually a description, but we have some idea of how the games are played. They're less pretty. So these are not from the tombs of Tutankhamun. This top left is one of the few examples of a wooden board that has been excavated and found in the archaeological record for the game of duodecim scripta, duodecim 12. It's 3 rows of 12. It's the predecessor of the modern game of backgammon. It's played with dice. Duodecim scripta, we have 2 of them. This one is actually from Sudan, in Kustul, and the other one is in Denmark, Vimose, Denmark. So not even from Rome, so to speak. So they may have played it on wooden boards, but we don't have much of a record for that. The other game on the right is La Truncoli, which is just a grid of 7 by 8, or sometimes a different configuration of squares, cut in a piece of stone. And the same at the bottom left, 3 Mens Morris, which is still actually being played today. A square with a cross inside, if you want to describe it, are some of the most common ones that we find in the archaeological record, and usually we find them in stone. So the game of duodecim scripta, alia, is another version of it. Is usually found on a slab like there on the right, quite a big piece of stone, nicely carved, but you can also just put letters instead of squares, and that was quite a popular thing to do. So at the bottom right you see actually a menu. So this was in a tavern somewhere. They put the game there, and you, instead of playing on a square, you played on a letter. And if you made a nice hexameter, you could actually play the game perfectly. So here on the left there is another hexameter, and you can actually translate it, and if you translate it with 666, you can actually play it in English as well. Now, this is not a very accurate map. This is just to show you that games that are Roman are also found across countries, across regions. They're found in northern Sudan, they're found in Egypt, they're found in the Near East, they're found in parts of what is now Turkey, they're found in Greece, they're found in Tunisia, or Carthage at that time, they're found in Rome. So they also cross borders quite extensively. And the only thing that we should remember that, again, we see them in the Near East and in Egypt, because that is going to create some problems later on. I mentioned 4 here. There are a few others, but we will... it's a limited set, let's put it that way. So, what do they have in common? Well, all of them, including the ones that I talked about before, have this abstract appearance. Just a couple of lines, not much else going on. 5 lines, actually a nice paper by Ulrich Schädler, who is the expert on Roman games, showed that it can be 5 lines, it can be 5 squares, 2 rows of 5 squares, or 2 rows of 5 holes, or 2 rows of 5 holes inside 5 squares. All of those are exactly the same game played by the Romans, called 5 lines. We don't really know how it is played. We have some idea. And that's actually the game that you can see here. I think I have another slide that will point that out. On the right, you see this 3 Mens Morris game 3 times, or at least 2 that are good and visible. On the bottom left, you see an outline, at least, of duodecim scripta, and then these little dots, you could say, these rows, 2 rows of 5 holes in there, is actually a game of 5 lines. This is what we call a game's context. We see them all together, which indicates that we have Romans who are making a couple of games together. Okay, and when the Romans left, well, then we got what I will call late antiquity games, starting with the Arab conquest and continuing pretty much until today. It's a different set, so even the Roman games did not really continue. There is some speculation that La Truncoli continued, but not everywhere. Ducum Decum Scripta is difficult to play, but it is resembling at least backgammon, so you could say there is a continuation there. 5 lines, we have no idea. And the set that is played in late antiquity is actually quite different. Again, we have the boards, the pieces, sometimes, not often, but sometimes, some dice. We have now people playing, because all these games from late antiquity are still played today. And that offers us some opportunities, because now we can also see if there are rule variations, which we cannot with Roman descriptions. That is just one set of rules. And maybe in a different region there was a different set of rules. Or maybe there were multiple sets of rules played by the same people on the same board, which is actually quite common, but not documented. So now, field work, so to speak, you can go out and see people play, document that game, and then go back to what you see in the archaeological record, because yes, we see these boards also in the archaeological record. So this is a fieldwork picture. 4 men demonstrating the game of tab in Petra in Jordan. And if you ever want to see a board carved in stone, you can go to Petra and find loads and loads of tab games. This is the game. So it is there in the back. It is little holes in the sand. This will never be in the archaeological record. And these are stick dice, throwing sticks, airborne, 2-sided dice, still played today, as we have them from ancient Egypt as well. Another one is Dale in Sudan, elsewhere known as Sija. And here again we see it played in the sand, which is interesting, because then we know that we will never find this in the archaeological record. And the game has been found in the archaeological record, but we know there must have been a lot more going on than just what we find carved in stone. It was briefly mentioned, so here is a picture of Sai Island, which I will get back to in a second. But here we again have this abstract appearance. We have some mancala games that you may recognize here, 2 rows of holes, sometimes played here in the United States as well, with rules that are made up, I will add. And we have a longer list of games, not that long, but I would say at least twice as many games that we have in late antiquity than what we have in, for instance, ancient Egypt. Now, if we go to a site like Sai Island, we have to cross the border into Sudan. You see that little curve into Sudan, that is the Nile. And that is a good marker for us to figure out where places are. And just beyond the second cataract is this Sai Island. Mentioned here because there are some curious things in Sai Island that will illustrate what now happens if we look at games here. We have a lot of them on a slab, but we also have a lot of archaeology in Sai Island. So we have one of the first excavations of Kerma necropolis in Sai Island. We have the New Kingdom. They have built a nice little town there. We have the Meroitic Kingdom with the famous, now famous necropolis that has been excavated at length. And the Ottoman Empire left a huge fortress there. So who made these games that I see here? For this, we need to do a few things before we can actually do the analysis. So let's look at the Kerma Kingdom, very famous for its ceramics, for its huge tefufa. It's a little bit further south from Sai Island. Has been the southern neighbor of Egypt for 1,000 years. Carl Walsh in New York did some nice research on the gaming materials from there, mostly game pieces. And everything that we find indicates that these are similar to the games that we find in Egypt. So you can say Egyptian games, but at least we recognize them as Senet and other games. Okay, so what about the Meroitic Kingdom? Famous for these pyramids, for the Meroitic scripts on the top left, for the extraordinary jewelry making ahead of its time. Do they have games? Sure, let's look at one. So in Sedinga, he was mentioned before, Vincent Franchini did some digging in the archives, looked at what they found in 1963 because there was something there in the pictures where they intimated that there was a board game found. And they, as you can see, put it in a checkered pattern because that is what we do when we think something is a board game. Of course, the checkered pattern didn't exist, certainly not then. Chess was not there for a few hundred years, and chess was not played on a checkered board anyway at that point in time. The game of checkers starts in the 1400s, so no, it was not a checkered pattern here. But they thought it was a game at least because we had some dice and pieces, so that must have been a game, but which game is it then? So if you put the whole set together, there are two graves with two sets. One actually had 3 dice and the other had 2 dice. One was a set of light-colored and dark-colored glass, and the other set was ivory and African blackwood. So 2 color sets. And then if you count them, 15 black and 13 white, so let's say 15 by 15, and then 17 game pieces, so that's also close to 30, and then 32 square ivory board fragments. That makes up a duodecim scripta board. Quite accurately, actually. And there's no other game that has that kind of numbers. This was very clearly a duodecim scripta board. So outside of the Roman Empire, during Roman times, in an elite grave, we find a very pretty duodecim scripta board in the Meroitic kingdom. And that is what usually happens when we look for games in other societies, including the Nabateans or the Palmyrans. They all have usually the games of that time. So I say games of that time because I cannot say they're Roman, I cannot say they're Egyptian or even Arab Ottoman, because they are not. Sometimes we don't even know where they're from, and sometimes we know that they're from somewhere other than Egypt, but also played in Egypt. It's just a time period or a cultural group that you can ascribe them to. The Roman games have a predecessor in Greece, but we have never found any intact Greek game board. There's some literature on it, but we have never found anything. We know that one of the games has inspired a Roman game, but what about the others? We don't know. It's not the point. We have roughly 3 groups of board games in antiquity. So we have a group that is associated with the earliest times in Egypt, we have a group that is associated with the Romans, and we have a group that is associated with the Arab Ottomans. I would say those are the groups that have been instrumental in distributing them. So those 2 give us a clue. Which of these 3 civilizations or each of these cultural groups or periods are we looking at when we're looking at this slab here in Sai Island? Because that is Tab. And we just looked at that. And that is Sija 5 by 5, very clearly. So we are very smack in the middle of a Arab Ottoman game group, game context. Yeah. And mancala games fit in there as well. And the Ottoman fortress, of course, fits in there as well. So it's time that I get to the point, because this is all not to the point. I'm just explaining some background in board games, but what I would like to tell you about is graffiti games. Because why is that of interest? They're not very pretty. But if you put them next to each other, something actually happens. So the pretty ones are always from Egypt because for some reason it gets preserved there perfectly. So we have this beautiful faience one on the top left, and we have this table from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And then we have that little slab of stone from Cyprus with just some indentations in it, which is also centered. And then we have somebody who, together with other graffiti, carved something in a slab. I think it is in Komombo. So what happens if you start looking for graffiti games? Because that is the point here. So far we have encountered them. So some people have mentioned that they saw a graffiti game in Deir el-Medina, for instance, in Egypt. Some people have actually studied a few games that were found, one on pottery. So isn't that enough? Well, let's start looking for them. So I'm showing you some examples quickly. This is all unpublished, so please don't tell anybody. But we find multiple examples of Senate games elsewhere. And we can use sometimes these beautiful illustrations here from the preserved game boards that have these wonderful indications to see, okay, where, which period are they from? So the A is the Old Kingdom, and B is the Middle Kingdom, and C is the New Kingdom, roughly. So we still see A also in the New Kingdom, but it gives us some idea. So if we look at these, for instance, then the one on the right is very clearly from the Middle Kingdom. And these little arches actually disappear after and only come into being after the Old Kingdom. But if I do this, I suddenly can make a very different map. I can make maps within a particular excavation. And that is exactly what I'm trying to show you here. So I showed you games across regions and across cultures, you can say, across time periods. But if we want to understand an archaeological site, we can now make plans and we can make maps of a particular site. For that, we need a lot of games. We usually find one or two if they're beautifully from a tomb. But graffiti games, they can add up. So we look then for a game's context because graffiti games don't give us as much information. Usually just that abstract thing. Usually just a number of holes, not really something cultural, not a nice text, for instance, that we can then date, or a nice illustration that gives us some art historical perspective. But this game's context can help. Do we find multiple games that can help us? Here we see an example famously published on from the el-Silsila quarries where it is superimposed. So somebody made a game on top of another game and actually destroyed the other game. That was unnecessary, but it has been known to happen. Sometimes they actually allow two games to be played by just adding something, so you have two configurations at the same time. You don't have to carve so many holes. And then we also have very particular problems, because now games start to look alike. So if you find 2 rows of 5 holes, that can be 2 types of games. That can be the game of 5 lines, which is Roman. It can also be a mancala game. Yeah, they're usually 2 rows of 6 or 2 rows of 7 and 8, but you see them sometimes 2 rows of 5. It's, it varies. If you find 3 rows of 10 holes, well, that is definitely Senate. Yes, well, we just asked in Jordan, do you ever play it on 3 rows instead of 4 rows? And they said, oh yeah, no, it's actually very popular because it doesn't take so long. Okay, so now suddenly 3 rows of 10 can also be the game of Tab. That's annoying, because I thought I knew what game it was. And then 7 by 7 squares. Well, that could be a game of the Roman game of Latrunculi, which comes in multiple guises, but it can also be the game of Siege, which also comes in multiple guises, by the way. So you probably know by now how mathematical it is. So we have 3 mens moris, 5 lines, 9 mens moris, 9 holes, do a Deacon square 12, game of 20 squares, game of 33. The only reason that we know there is a game of 33, that it was on the other side of a game box. One side was Senate, and the other side was 33, so 3 rows of 11 instead of 3 rows of 10. That's the only reason why we know that it is actually a different game and not a version of Senate. So I had to put it there. A game of 58 holes, and then these 3 that come in so many different forms. Mancala in many different forms. Sija also. There is too little research on Sija, so please do some research for me, because we don't really understand all the different configurations and how that affects the game. And Latrunculi also. There is some research on Latrunculi, on the variations that exist. So now we go to, for instance, Palmyra, and we go to the theater, and then we see this thing that you saw before, and then we know that this now is 2 rows of 5, so we don't know exactly yet. But since that is duodecim scripta, probably, and that is definitely 3 mens moris, we are looking at Roman games, so it's probably the game of 5 lines. And now have a look in Palmyra. Nobody ever done that. Been excavated forever. But if you go look, you will see games. If you didn't see it, you will see it now. Can you see it? On the right, where it is. Because as soon as you see one, you start to see a lot. It's in the shade, as it should be. So you have to look in the dark places, because people like to play in the shade, not in the bright sunshine. Do you see it? Here it is. Do you see them? Yeah, so after a while you go like, oh, hold on, is that a game? Yeah, there they are. They're everywhere. So here you see a game that is hidden under the silt. I put a little stone in each of the holes so you can recognize how the mancala game is entering that side. Here's one vertical. Oh, that needs some explaining, because this is difficult to play a game on a vertical board, but this is on a fallen pillar. And yes, so if you see one, you see many. So they're everywhere. And then it becomes interesting, because now we can make maps. So let's make a map. And this is the map of the configuration of 2 rows of 5. So 2 rows of 5, never 2 rows of 6, never 2 rows of 7, in these parts of Palmyra. So the theater, the famous Tentrapilon in the center of town, basically just residences, and in one of the temples. If I want to separate 2 rows of 5 and other configurations, 2 rows of 6, etc., I can do that too, but then I only can find the others in the Temple of Baal that was later repurposed as a fortress for the Ottomans. And that explains why we find 2 rows of 6 and more, because there were Ottoman soldiers playing. We also find 2 rows of 5, and if you look carefully, you will see that they are in the shade when there was shade in Roman times. All those structures are now gone. So they're in the bright sunshine now, but they were in the shade in the past. During Ottoman times, they were not useful for play. There is some evidence that Ottomans sometimes increased the number of holes of 2 rows of 5 and made them 2 rows of more to suit their own purposes. This gives us some idea about what happened in Palmyra. So we have a Roman game that was there, and then we have Arab Ottomans entering, and they entered with their own games. That is a history of the site that was not told before. Not that exciting, but it gives us some idea. Sai Island, I showed you this part, sure, but if you start walking around, you see them everywhere. You see them all along the coast. You see them in places, well, you see them now too, I hope. So here they are. And you can actually map them now. So you can make a map, and there they are, all the games all the way to the north, and then you see them mostly near the fortress. That is that structure there at the bottom. And that other structure is actually the dig house of the archaeologist. And that slab is just in front of there. So for Sai Island, it's similar. There's no local mancala game. That could also have been a possibility, by the way. Not the Ottomans, but the locals carving that. There is no Roman 5 lines. There were no Romans there. There's a games context, because there is several games there together. The Sija game and the top game was there as well. And there is an Ottoman fortress that explains that we all have them together. Yeah, I hope you follow that there is a certain pattern on what I'm trying to explain to you. So, if you're not tired of it yet, I will continue. We can go to Meroe further south in Sudan, the famous site with all the lovely pyramids. And if you look at pyramids, you won't see games. So you can look at many pyramids, and then suddenly, there it is. You see it? So there is a beautifully preserved, perfectly preserved, actually also nicely positioned game of 2 rows of 6. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you the entire story, but as soon as you see them everywhere. And the one on the bottom right is Sija. So we have Sija together with Mancala. These are Ottomans that carved their games in the pyramids of Meroe, which is a little strange and has its own separate story, but that's actually the interesting part. And we can make maps. So here are all the pyramids, and the stars are where we find the games. And we can do that in different parts of the site. So, I'm going to end, I think, maybe, with Gebel el-Silsila. This is a project that started in a very interesting way because I was in a conference that Mark alluded to in Leiden on marks and tokens of script, and a scholar, Maria Nilsson, was there and told me that she was excavating a very famous quarry site in Egypt. So I asked, we're talking about writing systems, but hey, I'm also dabbling in board games. Do you have some images of board games? And she did. And she said, oh yeah, and they're all Roman. And I said, oh, that's interesting, so show me. And she showed me images like this, and I said, oh, that's very interesting. But it's not Roman. No, it has to be Roman. Well, but it isn't. This is Siege, which we definitely know is not Roman. And it's on top of a quadruple al-Kerke game, and an al-Kerke game is definitely not Roman. That comes after. But look here, it's a Roman offering table. So, well, there you have it. The Romans would not desecrate their offering table by carving a Siege game on top of it. So we have Ottomans here. She said, there are no Ottomans on my site. They never quarried here. And that's correct. They never quarried in Gebel el-Silsila. That doesn't mean that we're not there. And the thing is, we did a kind of overview, and we found that the board games actually gave a separate entry into what was happening on the site. So we had a little bit of ceramics, not that much because it's a quarry site, a lot of graffiti, text mostly. And if you put them all together, you get some information about who was there. But if you did not include board games, Ottomans, Arabs were largely absent. There was very little in terms of graffiti that was Arabic, and way too little compared to what we found in terms of board games. So board games became a separate way of understanding the site. That has now turned into its own thing. Because after we published this, by looking at both Roman and Egyptian and Arab Ottoman games, I got regular emails saying, I found another game. And then I found another one, because as soon as you see one, you will see many. And that's what happened. So at some point I said, why don't we make a book? And she said, well, I don't know if it's enough for a book. And I think right now we both agree that there's more than enough for a book. So I'm showing you a few things. This is supposed to be published this year, so it's all a little bit under embargo, so be careful, but still I can show you that there seems to be some evidence for the game of men being graffiti. And if that's the case, that changes the entire picture of what the men game was all about. Probably the same for Mehen. We have some evidence for that as well. And as soon as you see one, you see many. And that leads to maps, many maps of games everywhere. I'm going to stop there for now and leave some open for questions. I have more slides if you like, if you want to hear some stories that are within this presentation. But for now, I'm leaving it at this, and you can tell me what else you would like to hear. Thank you very much.